I often come across some really amazing n8n workflows online, things that people spend days building, and they'll create some type of AI orchestration that uses AI agents, saves a company anywhere from 10, 20 to 30 hours every single month. And everything seems awesome until the workflow crashes. There's an error in the workflow, it stops working, and the customer is not happy. The reason why this happens is the person that built this workflow did not set up error handling correctly. And this is often one of the big differentiators from someone that is a beginner in n8n and someone that is more intermediate or advanced. So in today's video, what I'm gonna do is show you guys different ways that you could specifically handle errors within your workflow. We're gonna cover specific nodes, we're gonna cover AI agents, as well as the tools that are attached to AI agents. And we're even gonna cover something called an error trigger, which is just a workflow in itself that helps you log errors as well as notify specific stakeholders or people that are in charge of your n8n automations. Before we do jump into this video, I want to let you guys know that I do have a school community where this JSON will be uploaded. So if you want to follow along over there, and the school community is full of other people that are interested in learning n8n as well as data and AI and want to implement these skills, whether for freelancing or to help scale out their own business. So make sure to check out that, which is linked down below in the description. All right, guys, let's learn about error handling. Okay, guys, so these are all the examples we're going to go over today, as well as both of these workflows. So a ton to cover. Let's jump right into it. And the first thing we're going to cover is the individual node settings. So this is where I'd recommend that you start specifically with error handling. Now, no matter what node you choose, you'll go over here and go into our settings. And there's two different ways that you could specifically work with errors. First is going to be our retry on fail, which we'll cover at the very end of the node settings. And then we have this that says on error. And we have three different options over here. We have stop workflow, continue, as well as continue. And just to show you that we have this in every node, here's merge. I'll go in here, you can see the same settings, retry all three of those, as well as if. And the only reason why I'm showing that is someone might watch the video and go, hey, this has only happened in edit set. No, every node has these specific options. So by default, the one that we'll always find is stop the workflow. And you can see over here, settings, it says stop workflow. So I want to show this to you guys. Everyone that's watching this video should have had this happen to them at least one time. But regardless, I feel like this is the way that we have to start it. So what ends up happening is the node will be run, it'll get a red X here at the bottom, and nothing else past that node will run. It just completely stops the workflow if one specific item fails. So what we're gonna do is, guess what? We're gonna fail this on purpose. So we have that over here, and take a look. Boom, we got a red X on this side of things. And it actually has our error message too. It says Spotify streams expects a number, but we got Radiohead. So let me explain what we built in over here. What I did is I created a manual mapping, and I have a band called Radiohead over here. And then on our edit fields, I am creating a number called Spotify streams, and I'm passing in this string. Now, this is a bad error. You cannot have a string as a number. Radiohead is not a number. 50 is a number, 55 is a number, -55 is a number, 5.5 is a number. However, Radiohead is not a number, and because of that, you cannot convert this specific string Radiohead into a number. So that's why we have this error, and that is why we have this red X, and it destroys the rest of our workflow. Let's take a look at another option, which is continue. So let's say, for example, this isn't a huge deal. Like, hey, you know, if an error happens, we can continue our workflow. No big deal at all. So we're going to use the same use case. We're going to use Radiohead. We're going to try to convert that Radiohead into a number called Spotify streams. And if I run this time, you'll see that we're going to get a green check mark. And you'll see this if I run it again. And unlike above, which we had a red X. And by the way, to know that you still continue even with an error, you'll see over here, it says continue on fail. Execution will continue even if the fail nodes here present in the top right. Just to click in over here, it says error, Spotify streams expects a number, but we got Radiohead. And item is 0. And yeah, so this still works. The other nodes past this would still work as well, assuming that it doesn't need a specific number, but this will continue, whereas this one above failed. Now, I was going to show you the same exact example with the edit set, but for some reason, when I did this, it continued to go into the success branch. So I don't believe that should be happening if you have a type conversion. Like that's not a success, even if it passes the error message. So if anyone from the n8n team is watching, take a look at that, because this use case over here, when I jumped in over here, always went into success when it should have gone into error. But another setting, which by the way, I completely apologize because I didn't show you where the setting was. For the on error continue, all you do is move from stop workflow into continue. Our third option we're using is continue using error output, and that's this one over here. So sorry guys, but this one over here will essentially have two branches. And again, you can see we use error output. We have two branches, one that has success. So if this works as normal, it goes over here. If there's an error, it's supposed to go over here. And you can see with this HTTP request, I'm going to make this error on purpose. I just added an extra character at the very end of this API endpoint. And this is the same API endpoint I recently did in our Nano Banana Pro video, but I just added in an extra S because I want this to fail. And if I execute this over here, you'll see it, nothing in success, but in our error branch, we have a 404 error because this endpoint does not exist. If I got rid of that S, this endpoint exists. However, this one does not. So because of that, if you go over here, we have error, which includes one specific item. If it was successful, it would go over here. And you can branch the logic out, right? You can have some specific nodes over there on that side of things. And if it's successful, you can have additional nodes on there. But that is why you would want to use on error continue. And specifically go over here and choose using error output, because you can build out some sort of alert system over here. Whereas above, like you don't really get an alert, like it fails, but it still continues. This one, you could essentially build out a Slack or an email, or send the data somewhere if it fails. Whereas this one, it's very tough. This one, obviously you would know as well because it has that failure. Additionally, we have something over here called retry on failure. And this is pretty popular when it comes to APIs because sometimes your API won't work right away. So what retry on failure really allows you to do is run it multiple times. The default is we'll run this 3 times. It will go 1 second at a time if there is a failure. To show you how we set this up, let me just go over here to settings. We click on retry on fail, and it says max tries 3, and this says 1,000. It's not 1,000 seconds. You can see it's milliseconds, so that is going to be 1 second in general. And again, you can choose what to do on that error as well. I showed you the 3 options. We can either stop, we could continue, or we could have this error path. So all those are applicable over here. You can do that as well as the retry on failure. And just to show you, if you don't believe me, we go over here to our settings. We go over here to continue on error output. And you can see we have both. So we have this retry logo and we have the continue logo. I am just going to go over here and change that back out just to show you. We can go in here to continue, and then we're going to go into our next section. And you can see, there you go. Great. So our next section, what I want to cover is our execution log. So this isn't the best example of it, but regardless, imagine you have a large, complicated workflow and you want to debug exactly where an error was. So where this would be helpful, let's imagine you have your workflow that is active and it typically works. And eventually one day you find out we have an error and you're like, man, I'm stumped. I want to figure out what happened in our error. So how you do this is you go into your executions, and I'm just going to save this just in case, but I'm going to go into our executions and we are going to look for our specific error. And how you find it's an error is this over here. So you can see it says error in 27 milliseconds at 12:15. And what we can do is actually populate the exact error into our workflow. And the way that you do this would be clicking over here to debug an editor. Now, I'm not going to do that because I already have all these examples and etc. But what this would do is this would populate the exact data that failed in your execution into your specific workflow. I don't see a lot of people talking about this, but it's really, really a cool concept that n8n built in, because you can spot your error, you can put the exact information in, and then you can start working on that specific edge case. So make sure to take a look at executions. Other thing really quick with executions, this beaker, that means it's test. If there's no beaker, this is a one that's in production, which this is test because it's in the inactive state. Production, this would be in green. I'm not going to put this into production, but regardless, you'll see that over here. So if you see this error as well as this over here, you can just debug it in editor and work from there. Super, super important to know. Okay. Now what we should do is jump into our AI agent, because this is another source of failure for people. The first one that I would recommend for error handling is setting up some sort of a fallback model. Sometimes you'll hear OpenAI has an outage, or Anthropic has an outage, or Google has an outage. And you don't want to have your whole system break if one model or one company is not working. So the way that we can handle this is by setting up something called a fallback model. All you got to do is go into your AI agent and click over here, turn the screen, enable fallback model. And what you'll see is you'll get an additional addition over here. So by default, there's 3 additions on our AI agent. You can see down here, chat model, memory, and tool. We get this fallback model. And all you got to do is just add in your models, which is super, super easy to do. You can see if I delete this connection, well, I accidentally deleted that, but you can go over here. You can see all the models that are available to you. I can just go over here. Let's add an Anthropic. You set up your credentials and boom, we have our fallback model. Super easy. Another source of failure that people have is sometimes a tool that's attached to an AI agent doesn't work. Imagine it's like some sort of API. So what I would recommend that you do in this instance is within your system prompt, write explicitly what should happen if a tool fails. So on this one, this is a terrible prompt, but obviously this is just a tutorial. This isn't going into production. I say, if you do not send an email, respond with email not sent tool error. So you would want to specify it over here. Now this is a lot harder to debug than some of the other stuff above, which, stops and throws errors, or we log it, but regardless, we could have that. And maybe you have a specific node next, like an if node, and you have a stop and error node after that, which, speaking of stop and error node, that is going to be our next section. So what I want to do over here is go through an example. Let's say we have a workflow and we only want to have active customers in this workflow. If there is a person in this workflow that is not a customer, we need to stop and throw error. We need to stop this workflow. We need to figure out immediately how to fix this, because it's a big security risk. So we would want to have something like a stop and error in that instance. So how we find stop and error, you click the plus icon over here, you search stop, and it says stop and error, throw an error in the workflow. So that's all you got to choose on that side of things. Super, super easy. And what we're going to do is just go through this, and you'll see stop and error, we get the red X, and it says not allowed. And why does it say not allowed? Because that is the error message we populated. You can put whatever error message that you specifically want in here. I just put not allowed. You can also return an object. I just put a message for this example, and you can do other things as well after this false condition. I find that people use stop and error after like an if or a switch. Again, it's like a really rare scenario where you do not want to have this type of data in your workflow and it's there in some capacity. You want to throw the stop and error. Okay, so we covered a lot already. We've covered the stop and error. We've covered agent tools. We covered fallback models. We covered the different node settings. What I want to show you now is error handling in general and the error handling trigger, because over here we're going to have this workflow that fails on purpose, and we're going to fail it with this workflow set as active. And what we're going to do is send our errors to another workflow. So we're going to actually send our errors into this over here, which is an error trigger. So first thing, let me just show you over here how we could set this up. All I'm doing is I'm getting a form submission, and then we have our HTTP request on this side of it. And then what we do is we have an edit fields after. So super basic. I errored this on purpose. And then what I'm doing is I'm creating another workflow. And what we have over here is a workflow called error logging. So what you want to typically do is have at least one error logging workflow. You can actually have multiple error workflows if you want. And I'm just going to load this up over here as well. You could have multiple, but I would recommend at least one, and this should be a central place where all of your errors go into. So let me explain first, how do we actually send our errors into this workflow? So what you'll find is if you go over to the top right, you see these three dots, you click on that, you go into your settings, and we have under execution order, it says error workflow to notify when this one errors. So if you have any error in a workflow, you can send that error over to the error trigger. So specify that workflow that has your error trigger. You can just click this drop down. It shows all of your workflows in n8n. I label this as n8n error handling part 3 because it's part 3 of the video, error logging. So I'll show you how to set this up here in a second, but it's super important that you set this up because by default it is not going to be in there. So when you start a workflow, if you already have something for error logging, make sure that you specifically put this in over here like this. Very, very important. Then what you want to do is you have your error workflow that's going to be logging in some capacity. This is started with an error trigger. Now what you want to do is go over here to click this plus icon and you want to search error trigger like this. So it says triggers the workflow when another workflow has an error. So again, we have an error over here. It's going to automatically send our data into this error trigger. Okay, pretty basic. Now, one other thing to mention is when you have an error trigger workflow, you actually don't need to set this as active, which is a little bit interesting. So in the past, n8n used a price based off of how many active workflows that you had. And I'm sure people complained because they're like, hey, this error trigger, it would cost one of our active workflows. So this is the only one where it's like, if it's inactive, it still works like as a production status. Whereas everything else you have to have is active. So like this one over here, I set this as active to purposely send over errors where this is inactive and it works. So after you get your error trigger, you'll get a specific error like this. I just pinned an example of an error. So you'll see we get an ID, we get the workflow URL, we get the description of the error, the model that's being used, and we have all this additional information if you really want to dive into it. So it gets all sent over here. But really there's two important things that you should do when the data comes into this error trigger, which I called the error logging. The first thing that you should do is you need to log your specific errors. So how you can log errors, you can log our errors in something like a Google Sheets, or what I would personally recommend is you just have a native data table. So n8n has data tables within it where you can put specific data. So what I did is I just created an error logger over here as a data table. And I have the URL, the description, the date, the workflow name, and keeping it super basic over here. And I'll just update it with these specific errors. All you got to do is search for insert row. So you go over here, you say insert row. Well, actually you need to search data table, and inside data table, you just look for insert row. So you go into this over here, you specify the data table. So in this case, it's just called error logger. And then you pass in the JSON for everything that you specifically want. So for example, if I want the description, all I do is go into this description, paste it in like that. So super, super basic, right? Date, do the same thing. Date's a little different. You actually put just $now in here and that'll get the exact date. And then you have your workflow name, which you can just grab over here. Again, just drag, drop it into these specific areas because you want to have those columns in here, right? So that's the first part, is logging our data, and then our workflow errors would be logged over here. I could just run this really fast just to show you. So the green check mark, and you can see in our data tables, if I refresh this, we have some of the data that's getting populated in. Pretty basic, okay? The second part of it, so that's logging. The second part needs to be notifying people. So how do you notify? Well, tons and tons of options. You could send an administrator an email, and I just put a Gmail note over here. I didn't actually set it up, but you can send an email. You could send a Slack message. You can send a Discord message. You can send a WhatsApp message, like just depending on how you want to communicate that. So what I would recommend is you have your error trigger, one branch, you insert this data somewhere, Google Sheets, error table, native data tables. The other one is you send an email to someone to notify them that a workflow has failed. And again, you can populate the specific data that that person wants, build a template, and you're done. But all you got to do in your workflow is just click these three dots, go to settings, and choose the workflow to notify when there's errors. Make sure that you have the error trigger, and it's easy just like that. Obviously, you could expand this out as you want, but this is probably your initial MVP. So we have covered a ton today, and hopefully you learned quite a bit. In the beginning, right, with error handling, look at the settings within a node. AI agent has its own options, so make sure you set up fallback, because if this errors out, you have your second model. Also, if a tool fails, make sure that you mention what happened with your tool failure. We have stop and error if you have specific things within your workflow that you don't want. Typically, this is after either like an if or a switch. And then remember, going over to your normal workflows, specify where you want to send errors, and then you have your error workflow, which starts with an error trigger. This is the only one that doesn't have to be set as active, and then log the error and then notify someone. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you found it valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have well over 60 n8n videos as well. If you want the JSON from this video, it'll be linked in our free school community, which is linked down below. A lot of other people in there. We're like 200 members right now that are super motivated to learn n8n and apply those skills, whether you want to get a better job full-time, if you want to take on freelance customers, or improve your business. That's it for today. I'll catch you guys in another video.